All right. So originally I wasn't planning on going over Esther. I thought Ezra and Nehemiah would be 1 week. And then somehow I got it done in like 45 minutes. And not 1 week, 2 weeks. And then I got it done in 45 minutes. So this week, again, I'm not sure how long this lesson will be, just because sometimes I can fly through a lesson like this, and sometimes I get caught on something and I start running. And so this evening we are talking about Esther. Now Esther is set about 100 years after the return from Babylon. So after basically the events of last week, it is when Esther arrives, and the setting is, of course, the Persian Empire. It is in the capital city, Susa, right there, which is kind of where the mountain range begins. That's on the western side of what is today modern day Iran. And so it has been 100 years, but it's still Persia. It's still under that. And so what we start to see is we get King Ahasuerus. So King Ahasuerus is the king at this time. And Esther chapter 1 starts off kind of weird. What happens is you're starting in a position where you're not seeing really any Jewish characters at all. What we're just getting is the king is calling for a banquet because he's celebrating how great he is. Look at all the great things I've done, because if we'll look at the map, under him, Persia's expanded further east into the Indus River Valley and into what is today like all the stands in our map, and they've even started to invade Greece. And so it's a celebration how great of king he is, and it's, I want to say, a 2 week long feast. And so he's just partying for this whole time. It's not explicitly said how much he was drinking, but the understanding is he's been drinking for 2 weeks straight, and is consumed enough alcohol to not be making the wisest decisions. And he's not acting with the best mind on his shoulders. And so what he does is calls for his wife, Queen Vashti. Now, Vashti is not a Persian name. It is I guess the term would be Indus name, Sanskrit. It would be a name from someone somewhere in what's now Pakistan and India. That started, and so what we're seeing is he's not super concerned with where his wife is from, because empires at this time, they all have the idea of, no, you can only marry people of your nationality. King Ahasuerus is not like that. So he's just looking for women, for better or for worse. But the queen says, no, I'm not going to come down there after 2 weeks of you drinking and being insane and partying and doing all this. I'm going to reserve my honor, which the king didn't like, because he just doesn't like it. I don't know how else to describe it. He didn't like it, and so he gets angry, and he decides to have the queen killed, and he sets out a decree that every man in the households of Persia are to be the masters of the households. The women are to have no say, because he doesn't like being told no by his wife. Anyway, some of this is I bring up just because it's something we'll compare later. This is laying the groundwork of all the bad things, and there will be a shift later. And so the king decides, you know what, it's time, after we've had our party, which I included this picture just because I thought it was funny, that they decided to make all these Persians white.
Very European looking.
It's a very European tapestry. But the only way we're supposed to know that they're Persians or people from the Middle East is because of the hats they're wearing. Because there are some wearing fezzes and turbans in the back. And so it's one of those where you have to sit there and scratch your head and think, what? Yeah. Anyway, but this is going on. And so as he's having this feast and he's surrounded by all these his friends, I guess, all of these people who he's celebrating with, we get introduced to kind of how Esther becomes queen. Esther is the Persian name. Sorry. In Hebrew, her name's Hadassah, which just means Esther in Hebrew. Okay. I'm sure there was a greater meaning. We don't have it. Okay. And so it's just one of those, okay, all right, we'll go with it means what it means. Anyway, Esther is chosen because what the king decides to do to pick his next wife, he's going to rally them all together, line them up, and pick one of them. And so it's very much a beauty contest, if you will. If you think of Emperor's New Groove, it's that scene. And so it's just one of those moments where you have to sit there and think, especially because at this time, the reason why this story is kind of included is because it's telling the story of the Jews who are living outside the Promised Land, under an occupied territory, but they could leave at any time, right? I think this is one of those, and we'll talk about this next week, because next week we're going to go off the Protestant trail and talk about the Maccabees, which the Catholics and Orthodox talk about, just because that's a lot of what happens in the Maccabees sets up why there's Sadducees and Pharisees, and all these groups in Jesus's time. And so I thought probably should talk about those things. Anyway, but in that same time, what you see is kind of the same story. The Maccabees is a story of Jews, though they are in the Promised Land, they're under Greek occupation, and they're living a way in which they're different, they're standing out, and they're making marked changes. It's not as peaceable as the story of Esther, even though you could argue Esther is not very peaceable, because later on there's this whole thing of they kill all the people who want to kill the Jews, and so it's one of those that's not very peaceful. The Maccabees, of course, is a series of revolts led by a family, but they're all kind of connected in the fact of here's what it looks like, kind of building off that prophecy of Daniel. Daniel sees how Israel will just be subjugated time and time after, whether it's the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and there would be an even greater oppressive force that comes out of the Romans. And so it's one of those, this is kind of modeling what life looks like in this intermediate period. And then building off that, then you look at the New Testament and see, oh, wait, they were still doing it wrong. And Jesus came to teach us what we're supposed to be doing. Anyway, so Esther's chosen. It's not clear how many rounds of women the king went through, but it's clear that she just got on the list, and I don't know how to explain it. Usually the idea or assumption is Jews weren't lining up their women to go marry the king. So for Esther to get on that list, it's a little interesting. But you have Esther, she's chosen, she becomes queen. And the king is infatuated, like falling over himself. It's very much we'll see it later, but I'll bring it up now. Esther is always afraid to go talk to the king because, well, if she just goes and talks to the king. She could be killed because you're supposed to wait for the king. And especially going back to that first proclamation that's recorded in Esther. The woman is not supposed to be doing any of this in the household. So it's, again, one of that fearful, but the idea or the way it's painted is the king does whatever Esther wants anyways. And because he's obsessed with her or whatever. But then we kind of get a break from Esther, and we meet Naaman, or not Naaman, Haman?
Haman.
Oh, Haman. Haman.
Haman?
That's right. And it's Haman. He's an Agagite, which I found interesting, because that's a, what?
I think that's a rock.
You're gonna have to ignore his comments.
Okay.
So sorry.
Is it Agagite or is it
Agagite.
appetite? Or agate?
That's what I was thinking of.
I'm so sorry, Bergan.
It's okay. He's an Agagite, which means he's basically a descendant of the Canaanites. And so you're already kind of getting this, Canaanites are the ones that were in the land that the Israelites were told in the time of Joshua to go out.
I promise I read the Bible, but just it's in time to
So the Canaanites, so you're already starting to see this parallel of a Canaanite versus an Israelite, because at the same time you have Mordecai as Esther's uncle, and they're both kind of rising in prominence, because Haman, while he is an advisor to the king, he's just been that way. Like it's like I don't know how to describe it, but what we see is Mordecai is gaining in favor at the same time, because Mordecai stumbles across this plot by the guards saying, "We're going to go kill the king." And Mordecai then reports to Esther, and Esther goes and tells the king, and the king is, "Oh yeah, your uncle seems like a pretty cool dude. He saved my life. Good on him." And so Mordecai is kind of raised up in this stance. But Haman hates the Jews, and he cannot stand them, especially because Haman, whether it's his tax codes or collections or whatever we want to say it was, the Bible was not super clear on exactly what policy it was that got Haman promoted. But Haman is promoted to second to the king. Similar to how Joseph was promoted second to Pharaoh, it's very much you're not a Persian, but you're going to be the highest of the high. You're going to be over the Persians. And so Haman's there, and Mordecai, being a good Jew, refuses to bow down to any man, right? Which is kind of interesting since we just did the study of the kings, and a lot of the Jews were very quick to bow down to kings. So, but Mordecai refuses to go and bow down for Haman, which just gets under his skin, and he says, "All Jews must die now." And so what happens is Haman says, "All right, we're going to cast a die or a pur," which is not super important right now. And what happens is on the 13th day of the 11th month, which is the 13th day of Adar, the Jews will be killed. They will be exterminated, and that's it. And Mordecai keeps doing these small little things that get under Haman's skin, and it's just driving him up the wall. And so Haman decides, all right, we're going to build the gallows, and we're going to build the tallest gallows we can. And we're going to get ready to go kill Mordecai, and I'm going to go ask the king for a personal favor to let me kill this one Jew with no charges really brought against him. We're just going to go ahead and do it. But what happens is at the same time, Esther is trying to rally favor because with the king, again, very white renditions of these Persians. And Anyway, Esther serves two feasts, and this first feast is kind of to just gather the king's favor, to remind him of the good things Esther and Mordecai have done for the king. And at this, Haman is he's pumping up his own chest. He's feeling all of that. The queen personally invited Haman and the king to a private dinner, and it's just the three of them. He's thinking he's all that. And he's thinking, you know what, I've got this. And Esther is what happens is she's trying to set up a situation where the king doesn't suspect anything and Haman doesn't suspect anything when she ultimately reveals to the king that she is a Jew, and that someone has decided to slaughter the Jews. And so it's one of those moments, but because she says, we'll do this again tomorrow. Seems like a quick turnaround for a feast, but when you're not making food, I guess that's something, because she would not have been making the food, it would have been the servants. She's just the one who puts the food on the table, I guess. And so, anyway, that night, the king goes to sleep. He's sleeping. He's just lies down. But he's tossing and turning, and he's thinking, why can't I do anything? And so, to put himself to sleep, he decides, hey, can my servant go get the scroll of the Chronicles of the Kings of Persia? Which is a little funny, because he wants to be read a history book to go to sleep. So it's just that moment of, it's really boring stuff. But he specifically asked for it to start at his reign, and they're going through all the accomplishments and all of these things and all these important things, which this is kind of a snapshot of how and why Kings and Chronicles have different purposes in our Bible. Kings is very much a record in the moment, whereas, and it's kind of a running log. Chronicles is very much a recreating of that history. From what has been told and passed down. And so it's not unique to just the Jews to have a long history book describing all the things their kings did. It's something that everyone kind of did. And so that's also why Kings and Chronicles reference so many other books of history that we just don't have, because they're expecting, well, if this is Josiah and he's wanting to look back, well, in theory, Josiah hasn't burned down the library yet. Like, surely he has this other book of history that would also fit with this book that he's currently reading. They're not expecting, oh yeah, we're trying to put all these books together so we can form a biblical canon. Like, that's not at all what's really in their mind. But I digress. So we're in Persia. The king is tossing and turning, and he gets to the story of how Mordecai saved his life. And he wants the reporter to look back and, did I do anything for him? And it turns out he hadn't. And so the king says, you know what? That's what we're going to do tomorrow. We're going to celebrate Mordecai. Now Haman decided in that morning he would go up and he would go talk to the king. He was going to finally get permission to go kill Mordecai from the gallows. This is kind of where Esther changed, as far as the book is concerned, shifts, just because Haman is no longer the greater one. It's Esther and Mordecai together. But Haman, before he gets the chance to say anything, the king says, great news, Haman. You're just the man I was looking for. You're going to go lead Mordecai through the city on one of the king's horses, wearing the king's robes. He's going to be he's going to wear all the fancy stuff, and so he's going to be decorated. He's going to see everything, and the people will rejoice him, just like one would rejoice over a warrior. I don't know why I kept saying war and this topic. A warrior returning from battle, just like a great official would, just like a king. And so they do that, and it's burning inside of Haman this whole time. But once they're done doing this parade, it comes time for the second feast of Esther's second feast. And something is clearly different with Esther, whether it's she's letting her true emotions show on her face, or she's just being dramatic a little bit more about how she's truly feeling. But the king notices, which is something that I'm sure she was showing, she was having to drop a lot more hints because guys are oblivious to feelings most of the time, and it just flies over our heads. And so what we see is the king realizes, well, something's wrong with the queen. Something's clearly wrong. She is distraught. And what happens is after the food's served and after everyone's taking their place and they're all thinking they're having a good time, Esther says, my Lord, I may be speaking out of line here, but I'm distraught because someone is seeking my life. And the king is up in arms. How dare someone threaten his queen? Which is, again, interesting because he had no problem killing his first or his other wife very quickly in the first chapter. But he's up in arms about his queen being under threat. And then she goes on and says, my Lord, he's in this very room. And now Haman, it's not described that Haman's very bright. Not Haman. King Ahasuerus is very bright. And that, or he's just drunk all the time. Whatever he is, he's very slow at like picking up signs. But you also have to think there's probably more than just 3 people in this room. But it's still one of those moments of, okay, who else in this room would even think of killing the queen? It's clearly not the queen. He knows it's not him. So that leaves the one other person in the room. But Esther goes on and says, my Lord, it's because I am a Jew and I have been sought. And it is Haman who has set out this decree that on the 13th day of the month of Adar, I'm to be killed. And Haman clearly doesn't know Esther was a Jew, which I don't know. This seems weird that was included, but Haman didn't realize she was a Jew until this moment. And he's distraught. He's foaming at the mouth. He's in such fear and clings on to Esther. And the king then gets even more upset because how dare you even try and cling and grab at my wife? And it's one of those moments of, you know what? I've heard about these gallows that have just been built. And Haman, you will be killed on these gallows. And so interestingly enough, now we're seeing the mirror of the story. It's a chiasm. It's a, however you want to think of it. It's a moment in which now it's a switch, and everything that Haman had thought would happen, the opposite is now happening. So Haman is killed on these gallows that he had intended to kill Mordecai on. And Mordecai and Esther start putting together reforms. They realize that even if the king Ahasuerus has a chance to go sit down with every Persian throughout the Persian Empire and give them explicit word-to-word testimony saying, no, I don't want you to kill the Jews. That's not good enough as far as Persian law goes. Like, not even the king can overturn something that the king had just already said, because it was sealed with his ring. So what has to happen is you have a new law or a new order is said, and it's anyone who dares to take up arms against the Jews, are to be punished. But not only that, the Jews have the right to go and defend themselves. They can go and destroy the enemies. And it even goes so far in a later decree to allow the Jews to go hunt those who seek them harm. And so it's one of those moments in which now everything that had happened in the beginning has been undone, has been done anew. And that brings us to the 13th day of the month of Adar. And that's what is now considered Purim or Purim, I don't know, which is named after the dice. And so it's the day that was supposed to be set aside for the destruction of the Jews, but is now a moment of rejoicing in salvation. And I wish I could explain what it looks like in modern times, but everything I kept finding was like articles about why it's the gayest holiday in the Jewish calendar. I don't know. That's just what came up in Google when I typed in Purim, and they're like, "Why Purim is the gayest holiday?" I guess it wasn't gayest. It was the queerest holiday in the Jewish calendar. Yeah, I don't know. It was weird, but it's one of those moments where it's supposed to be a salvation from the enemies of the Jews. And again, it's interesting that a holiday celebrated in the 13th month, and this by Jews who aren't in Judea, becomes significant to all Jews over all places. The 13th month of Adar also has significance. I'm blanking on it now, but it's something that comes up again in the New Testament and in the Maccabees, as it's one of those days that just kind of keeps repeating itself. Let me think. I want to say it's either John the Baptist, something with John the Baptist, or something with. It's early on in Jesus's life that the 13th day of the month of Adar kind of shows up again. I don't know. I'm not. I don't know off the top of my head, but it is one of those. It's one of those dates that just keeps showing back up, and so, and then we kind of get to some of the structure of the Book of Esther, and I know that took me 25 minutes, but we're at the conclusion now. And so what happens is there's a little bit of confusion and ambiguity with the Book of Esther. One, God is never mentioned in the Book of Esther, which then goes on to even more of the questions of why is it included? But I think it goes back to the idea of it's because it's telling the story of how Jews act in this time of oppression under captivity, even though it's not really captivity because they're free to go back, but they're not under the promised kingdom. And so I think that's part of it. But there's allusions to things that happened in what you can say was God's role. And there's coincidences that just happen to lead to shifts in the story. It's one of those moments where, yeah, it's not said who does it, but you can kind of, he's the unspoken person in the background. And so you can kind of see, yeah, God is working through this. They may never say it's God who did this, or the God doesn't have a speaking role, but you can see how he's interwoven into the story. And there's also a lot of ambiguity in the fact that this is not a very moral story. It's one of those, a lot of the characters have moments of immorality. They're almost all of them, Jew and Persian, are undertaking like things that clearly break the Torah, and they're clearly going against the law. Murder, drinking, and sex are all driving forces for the narrative, and yet we're sitting here and it's in the Bible. And so it's kind of like how Song of Solomon got in there, and every middle schooler who decides, yeah, I'm going to read it because I want to be that kid in the youth group. They sit there, and you have to sit there as you're in the youth group with them and think, why is this in the Bible? And two, why did you think you wanted to read this? Yeah. But it's just one of those, it just raises questions about it. But what it points to, and what the conclusion you could say of Esther is despite the exile, despite God's absence, or how much the Jews compromised, God is not abandoning his promises. God is maintaining who he is, where he's going. He has favoritism for his chosen people. Yeah, and so, yeah, that's the book of Esther. If you guys have any questions, and or if you want to just start reading Esther, so you can also do that.
So I heard that King is I can't say his name. Ahasuerus. So I've heard it that he's also referred to as Xerxes.
Yes,
But I don't know how many Xerxes there were, or like,
yeah, so,
I want to see.
yes. That is a problem, because the Xerxes is, before Cyrus. But there's also a Xerxes between Cyrus and Artaxerxes.
Okay.
But then there's also people who call themselves Xerxes who are calling Persia.
Yeah, I don't
And
know
so
one.
it's one of those, it's like being named William. Like everyone's kind of knows someone who's named William or
Yeah.
Bill or
Yeah.
like, yeah, they're all over the place. Now, if it was all just like one dynastic line, yeah, okay. Because, Georges in the King's Kingdom.
Yeah.
Like how many Georges and Henrys and Edwards and like they run out of names pretty quick.
Yeah.
And Charles, like they're all kind of the same 6 names.
Yeah.
James, and so I'm sure it's the same way with Persia. Cyrus is kind of the outlier because it's like no one's claiming to be as great as Cyrus the Great. But Xerxes and Artaxerxes, well, Xerxes is kind of drawing on the idea of one of their gods, mythos, and so that's where it is. And Artaxerxes is drawing on the idea of I am the son of Xerxes, and so it's well, okay. It's going back to King into Second Kings. You have Ben Hadad. Well, Ben Hadad keeps showing up because it's the son of Hadad. Well, Hadad is also a common name, so the sons of Hadad is also a common name.
Yeah.
So it's just you have William, and you also have William's son, and so, but that's more of a surname and not first name.
Yeah.
But it's still that idea of okay, William's a common name and Williamson is a common name.
Yeah.
It's just going to keep repeating. Okay. So I don't, you're trying to think of it, if it's the Xerxes that you hear of Greek history, I don't think so.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah.
Because it's also hard to say because the Persians fight the Greeks all the time. And so it's one of those, as the Persians rise to power and push the Babylonians out, they come up against the Greeks there because the Greeks are coming in from the other side. Well, then the Greeks also come through again under Alexander. And then the Persians also come back in another dynasty and fight. We just don't we're not concerned with that one because then we get because Israel doesn't change hands, it's still Greece. So it's just one of those. But yeah, it's also hard to because so Ezra and Nehemiah was what 170-ish years being covered, and then as Esther happens 100 years after that, and so it's one of those moments where you're like, those are somewhat arbitrary dates, and so it's especially because until the Romans there wasn't a imperial calendar really, and then you have the imperial calendar which is then edited by the church into the Gregorian calendar. That's our calendar now, but it's still one of those you have to sit there and think centuries of time had passed between Persia and a standard calendar and a good standard calendar. And so it's one of those, because you have scholars who even debate when the temple was built, and we have like a firm date explaining what year it was when the temple was built. And so it was just one of those moments of, I don't know. It's hard to say which Xerxes it is. It's also hard to say at times. Because again, you'll get like Artaxerxes the second. Well, it's probably a wise bet that the events of Ezra and Nehemiah happened under Artaxerxes the second, but it's not like for sure.
Yeah.
So it could have been Artaxerxes the first or Artaxerxes the third. We just know it's in Artaxerxes. I don't know if I've answered your question or not.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if I will be here still, but. Is this on?
So they could have left, but
Yeah.
they, a lot of them just decided to chill.
Yeah,
Okay.
because part of it is, what you see is, they didn't want to be in Babylon, right?
Sure.
They did not want to be Babylonian captives. Because it was that moment of where they realized we want to be on the other side of the fence, and then they realized the other side of the fence is actually worse. So you see the history of, that's what the Kings is building up to. All the prophets are saying, no, you don't want to be on the other side, that's worse than where you're at currently. And then you get finally the moment of, oh yeah, this is not great, you don't want to be here. But then the Persians, the understanding is, well, they're not the Babylonians. And so Persians don't seem to really have the strict caste system, if you will, of certain races are less than other races. Well, the king surely doesn't see that. There's some advisors like Haman who would say, no, there are good races and there's bad races, but then you're starting to run into this whole question of what's that all about? But it's, again, they're not slaves under Persia, they're just people in Persia. And so there's, why would we leave? We've set up shop here. It's gonna seem kind of off topic slightly, but it's no, yeah, I'll go here. So in the aftermath of World War II, you have the Jews who wanted to stay in Europe, and you have the Jews who wanted to go to Israel, because that was set up by Sykes-Picot and the British Mandate and all that. And they were saying, Jews, go back to the home. We've designed this movement is establish Israel. And so, but then you have the Jews who are like, well, there's no problem if we just stay in Europe. Like Hitler's not in power anymore. I'm not going to get killed for being a Jew in France anymore. And so it's one of those moments of not comparing that as, but it's it's a bad comparison, but it's still one of those. Yeah, there was a lot that went to the promised land because they're very much in favor of, yes, we want our own place, we want our own established. When Cyrus comes to king and says, you guys can reestablish Judea, there's a sect of them that says, yes, that's what we want, that's where we go. But they're not forcing them to leave. And so the Jews are just sitting there like, yeah, but I like Persia. And so that's kind of where this whole breakdown is. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Okay.
They decided to just basically have purge the rules
Yeah, like
and just fight each other. It's lawful.
I don't understand, but okay. I understand what you were saying.
Okay. Aaron, you had your hand
Oh, yeah, I had a question.
Okay.
I seem to recall when my father taught this lesson on Esther, that he made a connection between Haman and some of the kings that the Israelites failed to kill from Canaan.
Mhm.
Was that correct?
Yes, so going back, Haman is an Agagite, which is a Canaanite or a descendant of Canaan. Well, if the kings and if the conquest of Joshua was successful, and the conquest of the kings was successful, there should not be any Canaanites, period. Like that was, Joshua was told you are to slaughter every man, woman, and child, hamstring the horses. Like there is nothing to be left in the land of Canaan except you guys. Well, we know they failed. Gad is not Gad, Dan Dan is one of the like biggest examples of this. Dan fails to go in and destroy the Philistines. Now Judah then takes up the mantle and says, "We will go destroy the Philistines." But since it's not Dan taking over the Philistines, God says the Philistines will always remain, right? And it's still one of those. You have Canaanites who escape the sword. You have the Gibeonites who deceive the Israelites and say, "Well, we're from a far off land and we have heard of your destruction. Spare us." Well, then you enter a covenant with the Gibeonites and they cross over the hill and realize, oh wait, there's Gibeon. And so the Gibeonites are spared. And then you get the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites. And these guys, though they are Moab and Edom are very closely tied to the nation of Israel and the people of Israel. It's still one of those like, there were times in which God told the Israelites, you are to go destroy them and wipe them out, and they did. And so there is I guess there's the part of the evangelical Protestant movement that likes to say, because they didn't do it, that's why the nation of Israel was surrounded in this way today. Yes and no. Could it be true that the reason why the Gaza Strip has never been Israeli territory, could that be part of going back to the Bible? Sure. Does that explain why Hamas is trying to kill Israel? No. It's like that we are conflating too many things. And could you say that's why Jordan has control over the East Bank? Not really. Like that's just because Edom and Moab and Ammon become Jordan. Well, again, that's not why Jordan's there. Jordan's there because Sykes-Picot drew lines in the middle of a desert and said, "This is what we're going to have." And they installed a king that has no like true relation to the people, and that's why Jordan's there. We can go into modern day Middle Eastern politics more. I doubt you want that, but it's that. You get that conflation of, and I'm way off your question there, but yes, what you're seeing is there's people from the tribes and the nations that the Israelites were told, when you enter this land, wipe them out completely, that you're seeing once again prop up and cause problems for the Israelites.
So that's essentially just asking if maybe Haman had some motive.
Oh yeah, like I'm sure he's heard
because they didn't kill them, but they kicked them out.
Yeah, like he's probably inherited a lot of hatred, but it's still one of those moments of, in theory, hatred's not a genetic trait that you're just passed along. And could he have learned a different reason why they hated the Jews?
Yeah,
sure, but it's also one of those.
People have been known to hold grudges for generations. He's
clearly a wealthy, well-educated man, serving as second in command to the king as far as domestic policy is. His family was probably wealthy then and well-educated, and so they're telling him, for people from the land of Canaan, the Israelites came in and wiped out our neighbors and our brothers and our cousins, and we escaped and we fled to Babylon, or we fled to Persia, and that's how we rebuilt our life here. And then you get the problem of, all right, now that all these Jews are around, and, I'm sure Haman was like, man, all these bedtime stories I've heard of how terrible the Jews are were right. Were they overblown? Yes. It's like those fishing stories. Every time the fish gets bigger, every time you tell the bedtime story, the atrocities get bigger, and for why you should hate this group.
And if you're looking for it, you'll find it.
Oh yeah, like if you're looking for a reason to hate someone, you're gonna find it. It's that I just don't like their voice. That is a very you are picking a reason to have a fight or dislike someone. Like they can't control their voice. Now some of them probably could because it's very clearly a fake voice, but that's the voice they've chosen to present to the Lord. So.
question.
Okay.
So going back to the whole, like, there will be another empire even more oppressive than the Romans.
Mhm.
Does it mean over the land or over the people? Okay.
It's a great question.
Like, could the Nazis
You
fit
could
that?
say that.
Or is
There's-
that a rabbit hole we do not need to go down?
There's so many rabbit holes with that conversation.
All of them.
Because then you start talking about, do the 10 horns represent 10 different empires, and the 10th empire is the one that does that? Because then you can calculate, well, then you have the Ottomans and Byzantines, and so then you start like adding up, and then you realize, oh, we're at like 8 already. And then you're like, oh, well, anyway, especially if you're thinking of land, but then you also can think of, we're thinking of just afflicting the people. Well, that list is also very long. There's a long list of nations that hate the Jews, have done terrible things to the Jews. But the United States could be argued to be in there at certain times and not at certain times. And like, it's one of those, like, it just depends on time and area. And I don't think that's necessarily what the 10 is representing or what that more oppressive is. I think you could argue that the oppressive force is a empire of evil. This is representing sin and death. But you could also, if we're wanting to get more literal, it's going to be a 10th future empire, future whatever that will physically. A lot of people like the physical interpretation of there's going to be a 10th physical imperial flag or imperial occupation of the land when the seals are broken and a dragon comes from the sea and then the clouds open up and as the sun rises on the 7th day and the 4 horsemen are following behind the Prince of Peace, the dead will rise and attack the other dead people that are rising. Like, we can get down those rabbit holes. I don't know if that answers your question though. Other than most people like to interpret it as physical kingdoms and not just more of a group of it being a arbitrary group being oppressed in different areas. I think they're talking about an imperial force over the land.
Okay,
And so,
that does answer my question.
but the Jews also have a weird focus on land. Like, well, you see in Jeremiah a lot of, they don't get over the idea that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed with the walls, with the temple. Like, it's a very physical understanding. So I think that's also influencing that interpretation. That's key.
Okay. So for you, with all of your Bible knowledge, when you went through Esther, like what part stood out to you? Like what part you were like, oh, this is a very clear tie to like this thing, or like when you read it, what neurons fired like, oh, this is, I see this and this, I see that and that. Like what's like one big one?
One big one.
A biggie, yeah. If any, I mean, you didn't see anything, that's perfectly fine too.
He just wouldn't be a very good minister.
Yeah,
I'm trying to think.
I never read that.
A lot of things.
I just made this up on the spot.
No, a lot of things that like, I don't know. The way I read the Bible, and I'm sure you guys picked this up. I latch onto like the randomest things, and that's why like I'll bring you up in here, and you're like, oh, okay. Well, anyway, so I guess one of them was the Queen Vashti, because then I started going down the whole. That's not Persian, and I looked at. Well, really, in Esther, you get Persian or Hebrew names, but Vashti is not a Hebrew or Persian name, and so that I went down that rabbit hole. Not that that's significant to the story at all, other than, but I think if we're wanting a significant point, you could say it's kind of, again, back to that unspoken role that God takes in this, that it's, yes, God seems to be silent. And we'll even see this with next week in the Maccabees, and even we can look at church history in the New Testament era and kind kind of even modern day of, yeah, God's not appearing in a burning bush. God's not tapping someone on the shoulder and giving them, or he's not revealing his throne room to some guy who's just sitting by a river in Babylon. Like God's not as loud as he was. It doesn't mean he's not there. God is still there behind the scenes. He's still there in a silent partner role, but I think that's most important as we apply it to our lives. Yes, we can, as we look towards the end of time, and we're thinking, yeah, God will get loud the closer we get to the end of time. But that doesn't mean God is just not doing anything. No, God is still very present, even in times where it seems like he's silent. It goes against that idea of God created the world, wound up like a stopwatch, and just set it and let it run. Where did you get that from reading the Bible, from looking at human history? Like, I could see, yeah, we're not having the burning bush every other week. But the burning bush was special for Moses. Like, even Christ did not have a burning bush moment. Well, we could argue the baptism, the Holy Spirit coming down from heaven like a dove. That was the transfiguration. Like, he has moments, but it's not like God doesn't whip out the burning bush again. He's not forceful. Like, it's significant for that time, that moment, because he's wanting it to. What is happening is significant for this. Moses needs, like, what was told to Moses is important because it was told to Moses. If everyone saw God in a burning bush, then what happens with Moses is not as right. If everyone had saw the throne room of God sitting next to a river in Babylon, it's not significant that Ezekiel saw it. If every time a prophet was called, he is transported in a dream to the throne room of God, and his cherubim places hot coals on his mouth, what is important about Isaiah and Jeremiah? Like, I guess it's just Isaiah. Right?
It happened, I know it happened to Isaiah because he's commissioned afterwards.
Then it is Isaiah. And so if it's not, like, there's those significant moments, and that doesn't mean he only works in the significant moments. God is always working. God is always there. He's always present. His people should be able to always identify when God has been at work. You can't tell me that Esther and Mordecai don't look back at the end and see, oh wait, God was working through all this. Oh wait, God protected me when I had to go talk to the king and realize that if I spoke out of turn and the king didn't find favor, I would die. God had to be there when my worst enemy was going to the king to ask him to kill me right then and there. But the king didn't turn it into a time of blessing for me. God was still present, right? But he wasn't visible, or it wasn't a loud moment. Going back to Elijah and the thunderstorm and the fire and the earthquake, that's not where God is. God is in the whisper. That doesn't mean God isn't in the fire and the lightning and the earthquake. He does have his moments where it is clear as day. He is making it known. This is what God says. But for most of human history, most of the biblical account, it's whispers. It's whispers that influence the people of God. It's whispers that influence the church. It's whispers that guide us and direct us. So that's where we're at. Any other questions? That did fill in the rest of the 20 minutes, so you're good.
I think it's picture.
All right, next week we're going to talk about the Maccabees. Just as a heads up, the Maccabees is 4 books. I can send you a copy if you would like to read the 4 books.
Yeah, I'm free. I have nothing. I'm class show.
But it will be, again, more of an. I'll hit the main points in the class and such. If you want to read it, let me know. I can give it to you.
Yeah, yes, yes.
But,
I'm expecting a full and thorough history of the holiday armadillo.
Yes.
Thank you.
okay, I can see what I can do. But, just a quick side note, I'll bring this up again next week. In Jewish names, after the return from exile, you see a lot of Cyruses start popping up in Jewish names. Well, the Maccabees is why Judas becomes a popular name. And so Judas Iscariot, Judas not Iscariot, like they're named after the Judas Maccabeus. So that's where it comes from.
Also, the guy Judas Maccabeus wrote the Maccabees.
No,
Or
but
he was just the dude in the Maccabees.
he's the main character, basically.
Oh.
It's his family, right?
Okay.
And they lead a revolt. It's the Maccabean revolt.
We don't like this silly thing.
His name is Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus doesn't sound Jewish.
So,
Yeah, it almost sounds Greek.
it's almost like they're under the influence of the Greeks. Yeah. But, all right, that's where we'll pick up next week. And then our mini series will be done next week. And then 27th, we'll have an all church Devo. And then January and February, there's 2 other mini series where you can jump into one of the bigger classes. So